The first torpedo struck at 6:32 o'clock, sending a violent shudder through the heavy cruiser Atago's steel hull. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 23, 1944, the massive warship, flagship of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, lurched to starboard as seawater rushed into her engine rooms. The American submarine USS Darter had found its mark in the treacherous waters of Palawan Passage, and with that single torpedo, the largest naval battle in human history had begun. 4 days earlier, American forces had stormed ashore at Leyte in the Philippine Islands. General Douglas MacArthur had returned, as promised, but his foothold remained precarious. In the smoke-filled war rooms of Tokyo, Admiral Soimu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, knew this was Japan's final opportunity to strike a crippling blow against the American war machine. Operation Shogo, Victory Operation, would commit nearly every remaining major warship in the Imperial Japanese Navy to one desperate all-or-nothing gamble. The plan was audacious in its complexity. 4 separate naval forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions, catching the Americans in a devastating pincer movement. Vice Admiral Kurita's center force, the most powerful of the 4, would transit the dangerous waters of the central Philippines with 9 battleships, including the massive Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, along with 10 cruisers and 15 destroyers. Their mission: smash through the American fleet and obliterate the landing forces on Leyte's beaches. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would lead his southern force through the narrow confines of Surigao Strait, striking from the south with 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 4 destroyers. A smaller force under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima would follow behind, adding 2 more cruisers and 4 destroyers to the southern assault. But perhaps the most crucial element was Vice Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa's northern force, 4 aircraft carriers with barely 300 aircraft between them, sailing boldly south from Japan. These carriers, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, now served as elaborate bait. Their mission was to lure away Admiral William F. Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, clearing the path for Kurita's battleships to reach the vulnerable American transports in Leyte Gulf. Against this Japanese armada stood the combined might of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Admiral Halsey commanded the Third Fleet with its fast carriers and new battleships, while Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet protected the Leyte beachhead with older battleships, escort carriers, and countless destroyers and escorts. Together, they fielded over 200 warships and 1,500 carrier-based aircraft, a force that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. But numbers alone would not determine the outcome of this titanic struggle. In the vast waters of the Philippine archipelago, confusion, miscommunication, and the fog of war would play decisive roles in shaping the destiny of 2 nations. First blood in Palawan Passage, the USS Darter's periscope broke the surface at 0516 hours on October 23rd, revealing a sight that made Commander David McClintock's pulse quicken. Stretched across the horizon in perfect formation were the dark silhouettes of Kurita's center force, the most powerful collection of Japanese warships ever assembled. The massive battleships Yamato and Musashi dominated the formation, their pagoda-like superstructures towering above the surrounding cruisers and destroyers. McClintock quickly called for his fellow submarine commander aboard the nearby USS Dace. Within minutes, both submarines were maneuvering for attack positions, their crews moving with the silent efficiency born of countless drills. The element of surprise was theirs. Kurita's ships maintained strict radio silence, unaware that American submarines prowled these waters. At precisely 06:32 o'clock, the Darter's torpedoes found their target. The Atago, Kurita's flagship, shuddered under multiple impacts as her hull plates buckled and seawater flooded her compartments. On the bridge, Kurita felt the deck tilting beneath his feet as damage control parties rushed to stem the flooding. But the American torpedoes had struck vital areas. The cruiser was doomed. "Transfer my flag immediately," Kurita ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding him. As sailors abandoned their posts and lifeboats splashed into the oil-slicked water, the Admiral and his staff transferred to the destroyer Kishinami. Behind them, the Atago rolled over and slipped beneath the waves, taking 360 men with her. But the submarines were far from finished. The Dace's torpedoes slammed into the heavy cruiser Maya, breaking her back in a series of devastating explosions. She sank in just 4 minutes, so quickly that hundreds of her crew never had a chance to escape. A third cruiser, the Takao, limped away with her stern nearly blown off, eventually retreating to Brunei under escort. In less than 20 minutes, Kurita had lost 2 heavy cruisers and seen a third crippled. More importantly, he had lost the element of surprise. American radio transmissions crackled across the Pacific as the submarines reported their success, alerting every Allied commander from Pearl Harbor to Leyte Gulf that the Japanese were coming in force. October 24th dawned clear and bright over the Sibian Sea, the azure waters sparkling under a tropical sun that would soon bear witness to one of naval aviation's most spectacular achievements. Aboard the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid, flight deck crews worked frantically to prepare their aircraft for the day's mission. Intelligence reports confirmed that Kurita's center force was steaming steadily eastward, despite the submarine attacks of the previous day. The target that captured everyone's attention was the Musashi, one of the 2 largest battleships ever built, a floating fortress bristling with massive guns and protected by armor up to 16 inches thick. Her designers had boasted that she was unsinkable, a claim that would be put to the ultimate test in the hours ahead. Lieutenant Commander Robert Winston led the first wave of American attackers, his SB-2C Helderver dive bombers screaming down through the scattered clouds at the Japanese formation below. The Musashi's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with deadly bursts of flak that rocked the American planes with their concussive blasts. But the pilots pressed their attacks with grim determination, their bombs finding targets across the massive battleship's deck. "She's huge," Winston called over his radio, pulling out of his dive as his bomb exploded against the Musashi's forward turret. "But she bleeds like any other ship." Wave after wave of American aircraft pounded the super battleship throughout the morning and afternoon. TBM Avenger torpedo bombers skimmed just above the wavetops, their pilots threading between the destroyer's screen to launch their deadly fish into the Musashi's hull. F-6F Hellcat fighters strafed her superstructure, their .50 caliber bullets wreaking havoc among the anti-aircraft crews. Captain Toshihiro Renaguchi stood on the Musashi's bridge, watching his magnificent ship slowly die around him. Torpedo hits had flooded her forward compartments, giving her an ominous bow-down attitude. Bomb hits had wrecked her upper works and started dozens of fires. Her once pristine steel decks were littered with debris in the bodies of his sailors. "Sir, we're taking on too much water," reported his damage control officer, his uniform stained with oil and blood. "The forward pumps can't keep up." Inoguchi nodded grimly. He had known this moment would come, had perhaps known it since the war began. The Musashi represented the old way of naval warfare, where massive guns and thick armor ruled the seas. But this was a new kind of war, where aircraft could strike from beyond the horizon and overwhelm any defense. By 7:35 p.m., after absorbing an incredible 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits, the Musashi finally succumbed to her wounds. Her bow plunged beneath the waves as her stern rose high into the air, her massive propellers still turning slowly in the fading light. Captain Inoguchi chose to go down with his ship, along with over 1,000 of his crew. The death of the Musashi sent shockwaves through Kurita's force. If the mighty super battleship could be sunk, what hope did his other vessels have against the overwhelming American air power? For the first time, Kurita began to doubt the wisdom of Operation Shogo. That evening, he ordered his battered force to reverse course, apparently retreating from the battle. But appearances, in this most deceptive of battles, would prove misleading. While Kurita's force endured its aerial punishment in the Sibian Sea, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force approached the narrow confines of Surigao Strait. The veteran admiral, his weathered face set in determination, knew he was sailing into what might well be a trap. American forces had ample time to prepare defenses, and the strait's confined waters would prevent his ships from maneuvering freely. Yet Nishimura pressed on, driven by the same sense of duty that had carried the Imperial Navy through countless battles. His force was smaller than Kurita's, just two old battleships, the Yamashiro and Fuso, along with the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers, but it represented Japan's southern thrust in the grand pincer movement that would decide the fate of the Philippines. Waiting for him in the darkness was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, a careful, methodical officer who had spent days preparing what would become a textbook example of naval tactics. Oldendorf commanded 6 battleships, 5 of them veterans of Pearl Harbor, now repaired and thirsting for revenge, along with 8 cruisers and 28 destroyers. He had positioned his ships in a classic battle line across the northern end of Surigao Strait, creating a deadly gauntlet that any Japanese force would have to run. "They're coming right into our parlor," Oldendorf remarked to his staff as radar contacts appeared on the plotting boards. The American admiral had the advantage of superior radar, allowing him to track Nishimura's approach long before the Japanese could spot their opponents. At 3:00 on October 25th, the trap was sprung. Oldendorf's destroyers struck first, racing down the strait in 2 parallel columns to launch their torpedoes at the approaching Japanese ships. The destroyer USS Melvin scored the first hit, her torpedo slamming into the Fuso and breaking the old battleship's back. As the Fuso's magazine detonated in a brilliant fireball that lit up the entire strait, her forward and aft sections drifted apart, each continuing to fight independently in the confusion that followed. But this was only the beginning of Nishimura's ordeal. As his remaining ships pressed northward, they sailed directly into Oldendorf's waiting battle line. The American battleships and cruisers opened fire simultaneously, their muzzle flashes turning night into day as hundreds of shells screamed toward the Japanese formation. The USS West Virginia, one of the Pearl Harbor veterans, had the honor of firing the first battleship salvo. Her 16-inch shells crashed into the Yamashiro, punching through her armor and starting massive fires. The Pennsylvania, Tennessee, California, and Maryland joined the bombardment, along with the Mississippi, each ship settling old scores from that infamous Sunday morning nearly 3 years earlier. Admiral Nishimura stood on the Yamashiro's bridge as his flagship disintegrated around him. American shells struck with mechanical precision, each hit adding to the devastating toll. His cruiser Mogami, already damaged by friendly fire in the confusion, limped away trailing smoke and flame. 3 of his 4 destroyers had been sunk in the initial torpedo attacks. "Signal all ships," Nishimura ordered, his voice barely audible above the din of exploding shells. "Continue the attack." But there would be no continuation. At 0419 hours, the Yamashiro rolled over and sank, taking Nishimura and most of her crew with her. The Southern force had been virtually annihilated in less than 2 hours of fighting, victims of superior American tactics and technology. Oldendorf had achieved what naval theorists called crossing the T, positioning his battle line perpendicular to the enemy's approach, allowing all his guns to bear while limiting the enemy's ability to return effective fire. It was the last time in naval history that battleships would fight a traditional gun duel, and the Americans had executed it flawlessly. Far to the north, Vice Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa watched the sun rise over his 4 aircraft carriers with a mixture of pride and melancholy. The Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, led his formation alongside the light carriers Zuiho, Kaitos, and Chiyoda. These ships represented the last operational carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy, but they carried only 116 aircraft between them, barely enough to defend themselves, let alone project meaningful striking power. Ozawa's mission was perhaps the most crucial of the entire operation. By sailing boldly south from Japan, transmitting radio messages, and making himself visible to American reconnaissance, he hoped to draw Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf. If successful, his sacrifice would clear the path for Kurita's battleships to reach the American landing forces. The plan required perfect timing and a willing enemy. Fortunately for the Japanese, Admiral Halsey proved more than willing to take the bait. When American search planes spotted Ozawa's carriers at 7:10 on October 25th, Halsey made the decision that would define his career. Convinced that carriers represented the primary threat, and unaware that Ozawa's ships were nearly empty of aircraft, he ordered his entire Third Fleet to pursue the Japanese force. This left only Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet to guard the approaches to Leyte Gulf, and Kinkaid ships were already engaged with Nishimura's force in Surigao Strait. Strike. Repeat, strike. The order crackled over radio circuits as Halsey's carriers launched their aircraft. Task Force 34, the powerful surface action group built around new fast battleships, raced north alongside the carriers, eager for their first real fight of the war. Ozawa received the reports of approaching American aircraft with grim satisfaction. His sacrifice was working. Halsey had taken the bait completely. Now it remained to be seen whether Kurita would seize the opportunity that was being bought with Japanese blood. The first American airstrike hit Ozawa's force at 0800 hours. The light carrier Kaitos took multiple bomb hits and began to list heavily, her flight deck buckled and useless. The Zuiho absorbed several near misses that flooded her forward compartments, while the flagship Zuikaku-Santi aircraft guns worked frantically to beat off the diving American planes. Lieutenant James Pierce led his SB-2C dive bomber in a steep attack on the Zuikaku, the carrier that had launched planes against Pearl Harbor. "This one's for all the boys who didn't come home," he muttered, releasing his bomb at the optimal moment before pulling out of his dive through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. The bomb struck the Zuikaku's flight deck near her island, punching through to detonate in her hangar space. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship as aviation fuel and ordnance cooked off, sending pillars of smoke high into the morning sky. Wave after wave of American aircraft hammered Ozawa's ships throughout the morning. The Kaitos was the first to succumb, rolling over and sinking at 0937 hours. The Chiyoda followed 2 hours later, her hull shattered by repeated bomb hits. By afternoon, only the damaged Zuikaku and Zuiho remained afloat, limping northward under the protection of their escorts. But Ozawa's sacrifice had achieved its purpose. As his carriers burned and sank, Admiral Halsey was racing north with the entire Third Fleet, leaving Leyte Gulf virtually undefended. The trap had been sprung, and now everything depended on whether Kurita would have the courage to spring his own trap in return. At 6:45 on October 25th, the impossible became reality. Lookouts aboard the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay rubbed their eyes and looked again, unable to believe what they were seeing. Emerging from a rain squall on the northern horizon were the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships, their massive hulls cutting through the calm waters of the Philippine Sea with deadly purpose. Kurita had done the unthinkable. After appearing to retreat the previous evening, he had reversed course during the night and completed his transit of San Bernardino Strait. Noah's center force, still formidable despite the loss of the Musashi, bore down on what appeared to be the main American fleet off Samar Island. But appearances were deceiving. What Kurita saw were not Admiral Halsey's fleet carriers and fast battleships. Those ships were hundreds of miles to the north, pursuing Ozawa's decoy force. Instead, he faced Taffy 3, a small task group of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague. The escort carriers, originally merchant ships converted to carry aircraft, were never intended to face enemy battleships. Their thin hulls and minimal armor made them easy prey for the 18-inch guns of the Yamato or the 14-inch batteries of Kurita's other battleships. Their aircraft were configured for ground support missions, not naval combat. By every measure of naval warfare, they should have been annihilated within minutes. Wholly came the voice over Taffy 3's radio circuit as pilots and sailors alike grasped the magnitude of their predicament. "Where the hell did they come from, Admiral Sprague?" A slight man with a quiet demeanor that belied his fighting spirit immediately grasped both the danger and the opportunity before him. His tiny force could not stand and fight. That would be suicide. But they could run, and in running, they might buy precious time for help to arrive. More importantly, they could make the Japanese pay dearly for every mile of ocean. "All ships, prepare for action," Sprague ordered, his voice calm despite the desperate circumstances. "Launch all available aircraft immediately." The next few hours would witness one of the most remarkable David and Goliath struggles in naval history. Taffy 3's escort carriers turned southeast, running directly into the wind to launch their aircraft while making smoke to conceal their movements. Their destroyer escorts formed a defensive screen, preparing to charge straight at the Japanese battleships in a display of suicidal courage that would have made their predecessors at Jutland proud. The first Japanese salvos fell at 0659 hours, sending towering columns of dyed water skyward as the massive shells bracketed the fleeing American ships. The Yamato's 18-inch guns could sink any escort carrier with a single well-placed hit, while her escorting cruisers and destroyers raced to close the range for more accurate fire. Aboard the destroyer USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans made a decision that would earn him the Medal of Honor posthumously. Rather than wait for orders, he turned his ship directly toward the approaching Japanese force and called for flank speed. "All ahead full." "We're going in," Evans shouted over the ship's public address system. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The Johnston's charge was both magnificent and doomed. Her 5-inch guns were toys compared to the Japanese battleships' massive armament, but Evans pressed his attack with reckless abandon. His ship's torpedoes damaged the heavy cruiser Kumano, forcing her to withdraw from the battle. But the Johnston paid the price. Japanese shells systematically destroyed her weapons and machinery, leaving her dead in the water. Other American destroyers followed the Johnston's example. The USS Hull and USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort so small her crew called her the Tin Can, charged into the teeth of the Japanese formation. The Roberts sailors, many of them barely out of their teens, fought their ship with desperate courage as enemy shells turned her into scrap metal around them. But the real miracle was happening in the air above the battle. Taffy 3's aircraft, hastily launched with whatever ordnance was available, swarmed over Kurita's ships like angry hornets. Many carried no armor-piercing bombs or torpedoes, just depth charges and general-purpose bombs suitable for attacking submarines or ground targets. Some planes made dummy runs when their ammunition was exhausted, drawing anti-aircraft fire away from their comrades. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable led his torpedo bombers in attack after attack against the Japanese battleships, his obsolescent TBM Avengers dodging flak bursts and fighter planes with desperate skill. When his torpedoes were expended, he continued to make strafing runs with his 50 caliber machine guns, weapons that could barely dent the paint on a battleship's armor. "Keep after them," Huxtable called over his radio. "Make them think we're the whole Pacific Fleet." The American pilot's courage and persistence began to take its toll on Kurita's force. The heavy cruiser Chikuma, repeatedly hit by bombs and torpedoes, fell behind with heavy damage. The Chokai, struck by aircraft from multiple escort carriers, developed a severe list and eventually had to be abandoned. Most importantly, the constant air attacks prevented Kurita's ships from forming an effective battle line and concentrating their fire. For 2.5 hours, this unequal battle raged across the waters off Samar. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, overwhelmed by Japanese cruiser fire, became the first and only American fleet carrier sunk by enemy surface action. The destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts fought until they could fight no more, their hulls shattered but their colors still flying. Then, at 9:11 o'clock, the impossible happened again. Admiral Kurita, convinced that he faced major elements of Halsey's fleet and fearful of further air attacks, ordered his force to withdraw. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since Midway turned away from what appeared to be certain victory, leaving the American escort carriers battered but triumphant. As the sun set on October 25, 1944, the greatest naval battle in history drew to its close. In 4 separate engagements spread across hundreds of miles of ocean, the fate of the Pacific War had been decided. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had once ruled the seas from the Aleutians to Australia, lay in ruins. Admiral Halsey's carriers had completed the destruction of Ozawa's northern force, sending the light carrier Zuiho and the veteran Zuikaku to the bottom. The Zuikaku, survivor of Pearl Harbor and veteran of every major carrier battle of the war, finally succumbed to American bombs and torpedoes at 1414 hours. With her death, Japan lost not only her last operational fleet carrier but also the final link to the glorious days of 1941 and 1942. To the south, Admiral Oldendorf's battleships had completed their methodical destruction of the southern force. The few Japanese ships that survived Surigao Strait limped away as broken remnants, no longer capable of offensive action. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura lay dead aboard the sunken Yamashiro, his sacrifice having achieved nothing except to demonstrate the futility of traditional naval tactics against modern radar-directed gunfire. And off Samar, the most improbable victory of all had been won by the smallest American force. Taffy 3's escort carriers, destroyers, and aircraft had turned back the most powerful Japanese surface fleet through sheer courage and determination. Their victory had saved the late invasion and preserved American naval supremacy in the Pacific. The cost had been terrible on both sides. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 12 destroyers, essentially the entire remaining strength of the combined fleet. Over 10,500 Japanese sailors died in the battle, including many of the Navy's most experienced officers and men. The American losses, while significant, were comparatively light: 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort sunk, with approximately 3,000 killed. But beyond the ships and men lost, the Battle of Leyte Gulf represented something more profound: the final eclipse of one era of naval warfare and the dawn of another. The massive gun battles of Surigao Strait would be the last of their kind, while the carrier actions and desperate surface engagements pointed toward a future where technology and courage would be more important than the size of one's guns. Standing on the bridge of his flagship as reports of the battle's aftermath poured in, Admiral Nimitz contemplated the magnitude of what had been achieved. In 4 days of fighting, the Pacific Fleet had broken the back of Japanese naval power and secured American control of the sea lanes to Japan itself. The path to Tokyo now lay open, though the road ahead would be long and costly. The heroes of Leyte Gulf would be remembered long after the last veteran had passed away. Commander Ernest Evans, who charged his destroyer at impossible odds and paid with his life. The pilots of Taffy 3, who turned their little planes into instruments of victory through sheer determination. The crews of the battleships at Surigao Strait, who avenged Pearl Harbor with precise, devastating gunnery. And Admiral Sprague, whose calm leadership in the face of disaster turned potential catastrophe into triumphant victory. Yet victory came with its own weight of responsibility. The young sailors who died in the waters off Samar, the pilots who failed to return from their bombing runs, the destroyer crews who fought their ships to the end, all had paid the ultimate price for their nation's triumph. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten, but it served as a sobering reminder that even in victory, war exacted a terrible cost. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had been decided not by superior numbers or better technology alone, but by the courage and skill of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. In the crucible of combat, Americans from every walk of life had proven themselves worthy of the democracy they served. Farm boys from Iowa had piloted aircraft with deadly precision. Factory workers from Detroit had operated radar sets that gave their fleet decisive advantages. College graduates had commanded ships with wisdom beyond their years. As the task forces regrouped and began the long process of accounting for their losses, one fact emerged with crystal clarity. The Imperial Japanese Navy no longer existed as an effective fighting force. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone. The battleships that had once terrorized the Pacific were broken and scattered. Japan's dream of empire had died in the waters around Leyte Gulf, though the war itself would continue for nearly another year. The liberation of the Philippines could now proceed without fear of major naval interference. American supply lines stretching across the Pacific were secure. The homeland of Japan lay exposed to invasion, defended only by kamikaze pilots and the desperate courage of a nation facing defeat. But perhaps most importantly, the Battle of Leyte Gulf had demonstrated the fundamental strength of American democracy in wartime. When faced with a crisis that threatened to destroy months of careful planning, American commanders at every level had improvised, adapted, and overcome. From Admiral Sprague's desperate defense off Samar to the anonymous radar operators who tracked Japanese movements through the night, the battle had been won by the accumulated contributions of thousands of individuals, each doing their duty to the best of their ability. The greatest naval battle in history was over. The Pacific belonged to America, and the rising sun flag would never again challenge the stars and stripes for control of the seas. In the words of one young pilot who witnessed the destruction of the Japanese fleet, "We came, we saw, we conquered. But we paid the price, and we'll never forget the boys who didn't come home." The thunder over Leyte Gulf had finally faded, leaving only the memory of courage under fire and the knowledge that democracy's defenders had proven themselves worthy of their cause. The road to Tokyo lay ahead, but thanks to the sacrifices made in Philippine waters, that road would be traveled by victorious fleets flying the flag of freedom. In the end, the Battle of Leyte Gulf stands as more than just a military victory. It represents the triumph of free men over tyranny, of courage over despair, and of hope over the darkness that had threatened to engulf the world. The young Americans who fought and died in those distant waters had purchased something precious with their blood: the promise that future generations would grow up in a world where freedom could flourish and democracy could endure. Their legacy lives on in every sunrise over peaceful seas, in every flag that flies free, and in every young person who dreams of a better tomorrow. The thunder over Leyte Gulf may have faded, but its echoes will resonate through history, reminding us of what free people can achieve when they stand together against the forces of darkness.